When we think of the Wild West, the mind instantly drifts toward the legendary names that have been repeated so often they've become myths. Billy the Kid, Jesse James, Wyatt Earp, and a handful of others who have been immortalized in books, films, and campfire tales. But the truth, the deeper truth, is that these names represent only a thin sliver of the true history. The West was not shaped by a few celebrity outlaws. It was shaped by hundreds of men and women whose reputations burned hot in their time but faded into ash in the decades that followed. Their stories are missing pieces of a puzzle, and without them, our image of the West is incomplete. These forgotten outlaws were not merely background characters in the drama of frontier life. They were often the main actors in their own towns, the ones who made settlers lock their doors at night, the reason sheriffs rode out in the dead of winter, the whispers that passed through saloons when strangers walked in. In dusty mining towns and cattle settlements, their names were once spoken with the same mix of fear and awe reserved for the most infamous gunslingers. They robbed stagecoaches and trains not for the thrill, but because survival often meant taking by force what could not be earned honestly in such a harsh, unforgiving land. These individuals were the shadow side of the American frontier dream, the counterbalance to the myth of opportunity and prosperity. For every prospector who struck gold, there was an outlaw waiting along the trail to relieve him of his hard-earned fortune. For every merchant building his business, there was a rustler eyeing his cattle from the hills. The power of these forgotten figures was real, immediate, and felt in the daily lives of ordinary people, yet they have been erased from our collective memory, victims not of gunfire or the noose alone, but of history's selective storytelling. The record of the West that we are most familiar with was shaped heavily by dime novelists, newspaper editors, and later, Hollywood directors. These storytellers often chose subjects who fit a marketable image: handsome desperados, charming rogues, or lawmen with a moral code. Many of the forgotten outlaws did not fit these molds. Some were too brutal, too unpredictable, too morally complex for easy packaging. Others operated far from the big population centers, in regions where journalists rarely traveled. As a result, their stories were rarely told beyond their local area, and once they died, there was no one left to push their legend forward. Over time, they became ghosts in the margins of history books, if they were mentioned at all. Yet their impact was undeniable. Imagine a small town in Indian Territory where a young outlaw like Cherokee Bill rides in, gunning down a storekeeper over a trivial insult, his reputation growing not through the pages of a novel but through terrified eyewitnesses who carry the story to neighboring settlements. Or think of Pearl Hart, the lady bandit, holding up a stagecoach with more audacity than many men of her time, her pistol steady as her disguise fools the passengers. These were not fictional characters crafted for entertainment. They were real people whose choices changed the course of events for those around them. The rancher who lost his herd to rustlers might have been forced to abandon his land. The family whose patriarch was gunned down in a saloon might have been driven out of town entirely. Each act of lawlessness rippled outward, altering the destinies of entire communities. The absence of these outlaws from mainstream history also means we lose sight of the sheer diversity of those who turned to crime in the West. Some were veterans of bloody wars who couldn't adapt to peacetime life. Others were immigrants, far from home and stripped of any legal means to support themselves. A few were women who defied every societal expectation, wielding guns with the same ferocity as their male counterparts. Still others were teenagers, barely past childhood, drawn into violence by desperation, thrill-seeking, or the influence of older criminals. These forgotten figures broaden our understanding of who lived and died by the gun in the frontier years. To recognize their role is to acknowledge that the West was not just built by heroic sheriffs and tireless pioneers, but also by those who thrived in the cracks of the lawless system. Railroads were guarded more heavily because of them. Towns formed posses and hired extra deputies because of them. Local politics shifted, sometimes dramatically, depending on whether a community chose to fight or quietly tolerate an outlaw's reign. Even the creation of certain forts, jails, and territorial courts can be traced back to the chaos these forgotten criminals brought with them. Their presence shaped policy, security, and the balance of power in countless frontier settlements. When we leave them out of the story, we create a sanitized version of history, one where danger comes only from a few notorious figures we can easily name. But the true frontier was messier, more unpredictable, and more human than that. The forgotten outlaws remind us that fear and violence were not rare events in the West. They were woven into the fabric of daily life. Every outlaw, whether famous or forgotten, represented a challenge to the fragile order that settlers tried to build. and the ones we no longer remember were often the most dangerous of all, precisely because their legends did not survive to warn us. In reviving these names and their stories, we do more than satisfy curiosity. We restore a missing dimension to our understanding of the past. We admit that history's spotlight has always been narrow, and that in its shadows lived people who shaped the world in ways we can still feel if we listen closely. The ghost towns that dot the American landscape are silent now, but once, they echoed with the bootsteps of these forgotten outlaws, with the cries of their victims, and with the uneasy calm that settled only when they moved on, or when someone finally stopped them. Without their stories, our vision of the Wild West will always be a half-told tale. The way history remembers people is rarely fair, and the Wild West is no exception. The men and women we call legends today were not necessarily the most daring, the most ruthless, or even the most influential in their time. They were the ones whose stories were told, retold, and polished until they gleamed. Fame in the Old West was as much about timing, connections, and public image as it was about actual deeds. Many of the forgotten outlaws were every bit as dangerous as the figures we see in Hollywood films, but they operated in the wrong places, crossed the wrong people, or simply lacked the kind of press coverage that could turn a criminal into a household name. Their crimes might have terrified whole regions, yet without a writer, journalist, or folk storyteller to keep their names alive, they faded into silence. Some of these overlooked outlaws lived and died in remote territories far from the big cities where newspapers were printed. A train robbery in Texas or Arizona might make headlines in the East if it was committed by someone like Jesse James, whose name already drew attention, but if the very same crime was committed by a less famous bandit, it might appear only in a local paper, if at all. Without widespread coverage, their infamy never grew beyond the borders of the towns they haunted. This geographic isolation worked against their long-term notoriety. They could dominate a small area, instilling fear in every rancher and shopkeeper, but without the echo chamber of national storytelling, their legend died with them. Others suffered from the opposite problem. They were too cruel, too unpredictable, and too alienating to become marketable villains. The public of the 19th century, much like today, had an appetite for outlaws who could be romanticized. Men who robbed banks but were polite to women, or who shot only in self-defense. Brutality without charm rarely sold well in the penny press. A man who gunned down innocent travelers or massacred an entire ranch family didn't inspire fascination. He inspired revulsion. And revulsion didn't fill theater seats or sell cheap novels. Publishers and storytellers deliberately chose outlaws whose tales could be shaped into adventure stories, leaving the rest to vanish from memory. Then there was the matter of image. The famous outlaws often understood, or stumbled into, a kind of performance art. They cultivated distinctive looks, a particular hat, a flamboyant mustache, a trademark weapon. They developed nicknames that stuck in the public mind, like Wild Bill, Billy the Kid, or Black Bart. These names acted like brands, easy to remember and easy to sell. The forgotten outlaws often had no such image. They might be known only by a common name like Tom Smith or Dan Clifton, and without a distinctive persona, their deeds were harder for storytellers to package neatly for an audience hungry for drama. The presence or absence of allies in the media also played a huge role. Some of the big names of the West had friends or relatives who controlled newspapers or had connections with traveling writers who could spread their tales. Others became the pet subjects of journalists looking to make a name for themselves. A daring robbery might be exaggerated into an epic adventure, and the outlaw might be turned into a folk hero overnight. In contrast, the forgotten ones rarely had anyone in their corner. When their crimes were reported, the accounts might be brief, inaccurate, or deliberately minimized by local authorities who wanted to avoid drawing attention to the instability in their towns. Another factor was luck, or, more accurately, the lack of it. Infamous outlaws often survived long enough to build a record of exploits that could fill a book. The forgotten ones sometimes died in their first or second major crime, leaving behind too little material to turn into a saga. A single gunfight, no matter how bloody, couldn't compete with a long career of robberies, jailbreaks, and shootouts. Without a sustained string of headline-worthy events, their names never became permanent fixtures in the public imagination. There's also the uncomfortable truth that certain stories were deliberately erased. Some outlaws were from marginalized groups whose tales didn't fit the preferred narrative of the frontier. Native American, Black, Mexican, and female outlaws were often ignored or their deeds attributed to others because the storytellers of the time catered to an audience that wanted white male heroes and villains. These biases meant that entire chapters of outlaw history were quietly removed from the record, not because the individuals were unimportant, but because they didn't match the cultural image of what an authentic outlaw was supposed to be. In the end, the difference between a name we remember and one we forget often comes down to who controlled the story. History is not a neutral archive of facts. It is a living, shifting narrative shaped by the people who choose what to record and what to leave out. The famous outlaws we know today survived in memory because someone, somewhere, decided their story was worth telling. The forgotten ones slipped away because no one fought to keep their memory alive, or because someone actively worked to bury it. By recognizing this, we begin to see the Wild West not as a fixed gallery of familiar faces, but as a vast, crowded landscape full of dangerous, fascinating people whose stories we've simply lost. They were overshadowed, not because they were smaller, but because the light was deliberately pointed elsewhere. Many of the forgotten outlaws of the Wild West shared one thing in common: they lived and died by a ruthless code of survival. This wasn't the romanticized honor among thieves you see in dime novels or movies. It was a raw, unforgiving reality shaped by the harshness of frontier life, where trust could be lethal and loyalty was a temporary arrangement at best. These men and women operated in a world without safety nets, without reliable law enforcement, and often without any moral compass beyond their own immediate needs. The code they followed was not written down, but it was deeply understood. Take what you need, protect what's yours, eliminate threats quickly, and never hesitate when it's time to pull the trigger. Life on the frontier was a constant gamble. Drought could wipe out crops, disease could tear through communities, and a single bad hand of cards could ruin a man. In that environment, some people saw crime not as a choice but as the only viable path to survival. Bank vaults, stagecoaches, and cattle herds were opportunities, not property. If you hesitated, someone else would take them. And if you trusted the wrong person, you might wake up to find a knife in your back or a bounty hunter waiting outside your door. Outlaws survived by staying one step ahead, moving quickly, and never allowing sentiment to slow them down. This survival code was deeply pragmatic. Allies were chosen for their usefulness, not for their friendship. A partner in crime could be valuable today and expendable tomorrow. If an associate became a liability, the choice was simple: cut ties, sometimes permanently. This ruthless efficiency kept gangs lean and effective, but it also meant that betrayal was a constant shadow. Stories of partners turning each other in for a share of the bounty, or gunning each other down over a split of stolen goods, were common. In such an environment, trust was a weakness, and emotion could be fatal. Violence was not a last resort, it was a tool of business. The forgotten outlaws understood that reputation was a currency in itself. If people feared you enough, they were less likely to resist, less likely to testify, and more likely to hand over what you wanted without a fight. Acts of brutality, a public shooting, a brutal beating, a sudden ambush, were as much about sending a message as they were about achieving a goal. Fear was a weapon that could work long after the bullets stopped flying. These outlaws also had an instinct for reading situations. They could size up a town in minutes, knowing which saloon keeper could be intimidated, which sheriff could be bribed, and which local rancher had cattle worth stealing. They paid attention to patterns: when the bank closed, when the stagecoach arrived, when the lawmen changed shifts. Survival in the West wasn't just about quick draws, it was about quick thinking. Yet, this code came at a cost. Living with constant suspicion meant that true companionship was rare. Many of these figures died alone, either betrayed by someone they once rode with or hunted down by men they'd crossed years before. The same cunning and ruthlessness that kept them alive also ensured that no one mourned them for long. Towns they terrorized might breathe a sigh of relief when they were gone, but the fear they instilled often lingered, reshaping local attitudes toward strangers, travelers, and anyone who didn't belong. For the forgotten outlaws, the frontier's lawlessness wasn't a romantic playground, it was a battlefield. Their code was not about honor, but about endurance. It was about making it through one more day, one more robbery, one more gunfight, in a world where tomorrow was never guaranteed. And though history has allowed many of their names to vanish, that cold, survival-driven mindset was every bit as influential in shaping the West as the laws written to contain it. Many of these forgotten outlaws met their end in ways as brutal and unceremonious as the lives they led. There was no fading into a quiet retirement, no triumphant escape into the sunset. The frontier had little patience for those who lived outside its already fragile order, and justice, whether delivered by a sheriff's bullet, a hangman's rope, or a mob's fury, was often swift and merciless. Death was not always a fair fight. Sometimes it came from an ambush in the dead of night, other times from a bullet in the back fired by a so-called friend eager to collect a bounty. And once they were gone, their names often disappeared just as quickly as their bodies were buried, swallowed by the dust and silence of the West. In those days, the law did not operate like it does now. There were few trials, and when there were, they were quick and often predetermined. A captured outlaw might be paraded through the streets as a warning to others, only to be led to the gallows before the sun set. Others never even made it that far. Lynch mobs formed in minutes, fueled by anger, fear, or vengeance, and the accused would find themselves swinging from a tree before they had the chance to utter a word in defense. There was no mercy for those who had robbed, murdered, or humiliated a community, especially in a world where lawmen themselves often lived precarious lives and could be killed at any moment. Some died in open daylight, the echo of gunfire bouncing off wooden storefronts as shopkeepers ducked for cover. Gunfights were rarely the drawn-out, dramatic duels of legend. They were chaotic, fast, and over in seconds. One moment, an outlaw might be swaggering down the main street, and the next, they were lying face down in the dust, their pistol still in its holster. Others met their fate on the open trail, cut down by bounty hunters or rival gangs. It was not uncommon for bodies to be left where they fell, claimed only by scavengers and the elements, with no grave marker to tell of who they once were. There were those who were brought down by the very people they trusted most. Partnerships in crime were fragile bonds, often bound more by opportunity than loyalty. A single miscalculation, a share of loot withheld, a careless insult, a whispered rumor, could turn allies into executioners. Many outlaws were betrayed for money. A bounty could mean survival for a poor farmer or a struggling rancher, and moral hesitation was a luxury most couldn't afford. More than a few met their end while sleeping, their killer walking away richer and safer for it. Once dead, the legacy of a forgotten outlaw rarely outlived the next news cycle. If they had no family to speak for them, no admirer to record their deeds, their story vanished almost immediately. Sometimes the only record was a brief mention in a local paper, 2 or 3 lines summarizing their crimes and death, without embellishment or sentiment. And for those who had inspired only hatred and fear, even that could be generous. It was not uncommon for people to simply never speak their name again, as if erasing them from memory would also erase the harm they had caused. Unlike the famous figures whose deaths became part of their myth, like Jesse James, shot in the back by Robert Ford and forever immortalized in song, the deaths of these forgotten outlaws carried no romance, no poetic justice. They were simply removed from the living, as efficiently as possible, leaving nothing behind but rumors and maybe a few spent cartridges. And without the machinery of legend-making to preserve their stories, they quickly dissolved into anonymity, their existence reduced to faint ripples in the lives they had touched, for better or worse. In the end, the brutal, unceremonious nature of their deaths mirrored the lives they had led, fast, unpredictable, and dangerous. The West was not a place that allowed outlaws to grow old. It chewed them up and spat them out, and once they were gone, it moved on without a second glance. For the forgotten ones, there was no ballad, no dime novel, no Hollywood film. There was only the silence that followed, as if they had never been there at all. Remembering the forgotten outlaws forces us to strip away the polished veneer of the Wild West and confront a truth that is far less romantic. This was a place and time shaped as much by fear, greed, and desperation as by courage and opportunity. Popular history tends to frame the West as a battle between noble lawmen and notorious villains, but in reality, the line between hero and criminal was often blurred. Many of the figures celebrated as protectors of justice operated in morally gray territory, bending or breaking laws when it suited them. Likewise, many outlaws were not mindless predators, but individuals molded by the harsh conditions of frontier life, where survival often demanded brutal choices. By remembering the ones history has forgotten, we gain a fuller, more honest picture of the forces that truly shaped the American frontier. These forgotten figures show us that the West's legacy was not built solely by the people who upheld the law, but also by those who challenged it. Every town that fortified its bank vault, every stagecoach company that hired armed guards, every rancher who organized a posse was reacting to the pressure created by these lawbreakers. Their presence influenced the pace of settlement, the development of trade routes, and the way communities defined and defended themselves. To pretend they didn't exist is to erase a powerful catalyst that helped forge the culture of self-reliance and vigilance that came to define the frontier mindset. When we bring their names back into the light, we also acknowledge the complexity of the human stories behind them. These were not always one-dimensional villains. Some began as farmhands or miners, turning to robbery after a series of losses left them with no other options. Others were veterans of violent conflicts who found it easier to keep fighting than to adjust to civilian life. There were women who entered the outlaw world to escape abuse, and young men lured into gangs by the promise of quick wealth and a reputation. These backgrounds don't excuse their crimes, but they do remind us that they were human beings shaped by their environment, not just faceless evildoers. The Forgotten Outlaws also remind us that history is not a fixed and impartial record, it is a curated story. The people we remember are often those whose narratives were deemed entertaining or morally palatable to the audiences of their time. Those who didn't fit the mold were pushed to the margins, and eventually, those margins were erased. When we restore these figures to the historical stage, we challenge the selective memory that has long painted the Wild West in broad, simplified strokes. We make it more complicated, but also more authentic. There is another reason why remembering them matters. It allows us to see how fear shaped the behavior of entire communities. Imagine living in a small, isolated settlement where the nearest marshal was a day's ride away, and word spread that a violent gang was operating nearby. People would change their routines, keep weapons within arm's reach, and perhaps even band together to take justice into their own hands. This climate of tension and readiness wasn't just a backdrop to the frontier, it was part of its identity. And the Forgotten Outlaws were central to creating it. By bringing these lost names back into our consciousness, we also give voice to the untold stories of those who suffered at their hands. Every robbery, every shooting, every act of intimidation left victims whose struggles are rarely acknowledged. Their experiences remind us that the Wild West was not just about adventure and opportunity, it was also about danger and loss. The history of the frontier belongs to them as much as it belongs to the sheriffs and gunslingers. In the end, remembering these outlaws doesn't glorify them, it humanizes history. It adds weight to the myths, grounding them in the messy, unpredictable reality of life on the frontier. It tells us that the West was not simply carved out by dreamers and doers, but also by those who forced others to adapt in order to survive. The Forgotten Outlaws may not have monuments or ballads in their honor, but their influence lingers in the DNA of the American story. They are part of the truth that makes the legend complete. And so, when the dust finally settles over the ghost towns and forgotten trails, we are left with more than just fading legends. We are left with the echoes of lives lived hard and fast, of choices that carved scars into the land and into the memories of those who survived them. To remember the Forgotten Outlaws is to remember that the Wild West was never just a stage for heroes or villains, but a place where ordinary people were pushed to extraordinary extremes. Their names may have vanished from the history books, but in the quiet spaces between the myths, they still ride, shadows on the horizon, reminders that the story of the West was written not only by the law, but also by those who dared to defy it.